London, May 1867, greeted the morning of Beatrice Hartwell's wedding with an unseasonable cold that seemed to seep through stone and bone alike. Gray clouds pressed low over the city, muting the sound of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones and draining color from the narrow streets near the vicarage where she had been born and raised. The sky held the dull heaviness of a withheld storm, as though even the heavens hesitated to bless the day. Beatrice stood before the cracked mirror in her childhood bedroom, hands folded carefully at her waist, studying the woman reflected back at her. At 28, she was considered past her prime by London society, a fact that had been made painfully clear to her for years through polite pity and increasingly rare invitations. Her dark brown hair, once thick and glossy, was pinned into a severe style meant to disguise the faint threads of silver already appearing at her temples. Her face was neither striking nor ugly, simply unremarkable, the sort that failed to linger in the memory. Brown eyes, steady but cautious. A mouth accustomed to restraint rather than laughter. Today that woman would become the Duchess of Silverton. The thought felt unreal, like a sentence spoken in a foreign language, recognizable in structure, meaningless in feeling. The gown laid out on the bed behind her was cream silk, modestly cut and carefully altered to fit her body. It was the best her family could manage, paid for through careful saving and quiet sacrifice. There would be no lavish lace or extravagant embroidery. This was a wedding born of necessity, not celebration. Beatrice exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had learned long ago that emotion served little purpose when one's course was already set. Her marriage to Alexander Beaumont, the Duke of Silverton, had been arranged through intermediaries, men who spoke of alliances and settlements in the same tone others reserved for livestock or land deeds. The Duke was 35, a widower of 3 years, his first wife dead under circumstances that were never openly discussed but frequently whispered about behind gloved hands. He required a respectable wife to manage his household and silence speculation about prolonged mourning. Beatrice's family required the financial security such a marriage promised. It was a transaction. Both parties understood this. She had met the Duke twice. The first meeting had been at a formal dinner hosted by a mutual acquaintance. He had been polite, distant, impeccably mannered. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes the color of winter steel, he possessed the effortless authority of a man accustomed to obedience. He asked her questions, appropriate ones, but revealed nothing of himself in return. The second meeting weeks later had been much the same. No warmth. No interest. No cruelty either. Just a cold, aristocratic reserve that made it impossible to imagine him as a husband, let alone a companion. Beatrice harbored no romantic illusions about what lay ahead. She had been raised better, or worse, than that. The bedroom door opened without ceremony. Her mother entered, closing it firmly behind her as though sealing them into a private battlefield. Mrs. Hartwell was a thin woman with permanently tightened lips and eyes that carried the exhaustion of decades spent enduring disappointment. She wore the same expression now that she always wore when speaking of marriage, one of resigned martyrdom. She did not waste time on sentiment. "Sit," her mother said, nodding toward the chair near the mirror. Beatrice obeyed, smoothing her skirts automatically. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them together to still the movement. Mrs. Hartwell remained standing, as though addressing a subordinate rather than her daughter. Her voice when she spoke was calm, too calm. "There are things you must understand before tonight," she began. "Things no one ever explains honestly." Beatrice swallowed but said nothing. "When your husband comes to you," her mother continued, "you are to close your eyes. Do not speak. Do not move. Remain perfectly still." The words landed heavily, one after another, each pressing deeper than the last. "A proper wife does not participate," Mrs. Hartwell said. "Participation encourages expectations. Expectations lead to disappointment." Beatrice's throat tightened. "You must understand that a man's needs are base," her mother went on, voice clinical, almost detached. "Animal. They have nothing to do with affection or tenderness. Those things are stories told to young girls to make obedience easier." Her mother's gaze was sharp now, unyielding. "You must never expect pleasure. Pleasure is not meant for women of virtue. Beatrice felt a cold spreading through her chest. "Endure it," Mrs. Hartwell said plainly. "If you remain silent and unresponsive, it will be over sooner. If you show awareness, if you respond in any way, he will think you want it. And once a man believes his wife wants such things, he loses respect for her." Her mother paused as though allowing the lesson to settle. "Your comfort is irrelevant," she continued. "Your feelings are irrelevant. Your body does not belong to you anymore. Marriage is duty. Nothing more." Beatrice stared at the floor, the worn pattern of the rug blurring slightly as her vision wavered. This was what her mother offered her after 28 years of life. Not comfort. Not reassurance. Instruction on how to survive. Mrs. Hartwell's own marriage had been one of obligation and quiet resentment, producing 3 daughters and little else. Beatrice had grown up watching her mother swallow disappointment day after day, wearing endurance like a badge of honor. But hearing her speak so openly, so brutally, about the marriage bed transformed Beatrice's dread into something heavier, more final. Marriage, it seemed, was not a beginning. It was an end. When her mother finally left to oversee last-minute preparations, Beatrice remained seated before the mirror, her reflection pale and hollow-eyed. She barely recognized herself. "Close your eyes. Endure. Never expect pleasure." The words repeated in her mind, steady as a drumbeat. The hours passed in a blur. Her sister helped her dress. Pins pricked her scalp. Gloves were smoothed into place. Voices drifted in and out of her awareness. The small church filled with guests, mostly the Duke's connections, as her own family had few acquaintances of social consequence. When the organ began to play, Beatrice rose automatically, her body moving through the motions as if directed by someone else. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, every step carrying her closer to a man who would, by law and custom, own her life. Alexander Beaumont waited at the altar. Up close, he was even more imposing than she remembered. His expression was composed, unreadable. There was no cruelty in his face, but no kindness either. Just controlled detachment. She searched his features for warmth and found none. The ceremony proceeded with solemn efficiency. Vows were spoken. Promises made. Beatrice heard her own voice pledge obedience, though it sounded distant to her ears. When the Duke took her hand to place the ring upon her finger, she braced herself for cold formality. Instead, his touch was unexpectedly gentle. His fingers cradled her hand rather than gripping it. His thumb brushed lightly across her knuckles, a brief, almost unconscious gesture that sent a shock of surprise through her. For a fleeting moment, his gray eyes met hers, and something unreadable flickered there. Something that did not resemble indifference. Then it was gone. The moment passed. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife. Applause followed. But the seed had been planted. The wedding breakfast passed in a haze of polite conversation and forced smiles. Beatrice sat beside her husband, barely tasting the food on her plate. Guests toasted the new Duchess of Silverton, their gazes assessing, calculating. Her mother's voice echoed relentlessly in her mind. "Close your eyes. Endure. Never expect pleasure." When evening finally fell and the last guests departed, the Duke rose and extended his hand to her. Beatrice placed her gloved fingers in his, her heart pounding so violently she was certain he must feel it. He led her through the grand halls of Silverton House, the scale of the place overwhelming. Every step felt like a march toward something she could not escape. At the door to his chambers, he swept her up into his arms without warning. Her breath caught. Her body went rigid. This was it. She squeezed her eyes shut. Stay still. Stay silent. Endure. But instead of carrying her to the bed, he stopped just inside the room and set her gently back on her feet. Beatrice waited, braced for what came next. Nothing happened. She opened her eyes. The Duke had stepped back, deliberately putting space between them. "Your pleasure comes first," he said quietly. "Always." The word struck her like a physical blow. She stared at him, convinced she had misheard. He gestured toward a chair near the fireplace. "Please sit. We need to speak before anything else happens." Beatrice moved as if in a dream, her mind reeling. Everything she had been taught told her this was wrong. And yet, for the first time that day, she felt something unfamiliar stir beneath her fear. Uncertainty. Hope. Beatrice sat stiffly in the chair near the fireplace, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her back painfully straight. The Duke remained opposite her, a measured distance between them, as though he were deliberately resisting the authority the marriage ceremony had just granted him. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across the room, yet Beatrice felt cold from the inside out. "Drink," he said gently, holding out a glass of wine. She accepted it with uncertain fingers. Her mind struggled to reconcile the man before her with the one her mother had prepared her to face. Nothing about this situation aligned with the rigid script she had memorized for survival. "I owe you honesty," Alexander said at last. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of strain beneath the composure. "Before we attempt to share a life, or even a bed, you must understand who I was, and why I will not be that man again." Beatrice lowered her gaze, unsure whether she was permitted to meet his eyes. "My first wife," he continued, "was named Catherine." The name seemed to carry weight, as though it had been spoken rarely and never lightly. "She was young when we married," he said. "Beautiful, gentle. Everything society praised and rewarded in a woman." His mouth tightened briefly. "And I believed that was enough." Beatrice's fingers tightened around the stem of the glass. "I treated marriage as a structure of authority," Alexander went on. "I was distant, formal, unquestioning of my own assumptions. I believed a wife's role was to adapt herself to her husband's needs, not to possess needs of her own." He paused, staring into the fire rather than at Beatrice. "Catherine learned quickly not to trouble me with her feelings. She endured. She smiled when expected. She faded quietly." Beatrice felt a chill ripple through her. "When she fell ill," Alexander said, his voice lowering, "she did not tell me how much pain she was in. She did not ask for help. She believed suffering was simply part of her duty." He swallowed. "She died believing I would not care enough to listen." The silence that followed was heavy and unbroken. "I buried her," he said finally, and realized too late that I had never truly known her at all. Beatrice's chest ached, not only for the woman she had never met, but for the future she herself had been marching toward until this moment. "I will not repeat that failure," Alexander said, lifting his eyes to hers at last. "Not with you." "But, you are my husband," Beatrice whispered, confusion threading through her fear. "The law, the church, they grant you rights." "They grant me power," he corrected quietly. "Not wisdom." She frowned faintly, unaccustomed to such distinctions. "Marriage built on fear is not intimacy," he said. "It is compliance. I have no interest in compliance." He leaned forward slightly, careful not to crowd her. "Your body belongs to you," he said. "Not to me. If we share intimacy, it will be because you desire it, not because you believe you must endure it." Beatrice's breath trembled. "I propose," he continued, "that we begin differently. As acquaintances. As companions. We will speak. Or learn each other's minds before we ever claim each other's bodies." The words dismantled something deep within her, an internal architecture built from years of resignation. "You would wait?" she asked softly. "Yes." "For however long?" "For as long as it takes." She stared at him, searching for deception. She found none. Something fragile loosened in her chest. The days that followed unfolded in a manner Beatrice could never have imagined marriage might contain. There were no demands. No expectations whispered into her ear. No silent assessments of her usefulness. Instead, there were conversations. Alexander took breakfast with her each morning rather than retreating behind newspapers or obligations. He asked her opinions, not perfunctorily but with genuine interest. At first, her responses were cautious, filtered through years of training that taught her to defer and diminish herself. But he listened patiently, never interrupting, never correcting. When they walked through the gardens, he asked her what she thought of the estate, what she would improve, what she found beautiful. She discovered, to her surprise, that she had answers. They spoke of books, of politics, of the growing unrest in the factories and the quiet desperation of the poor. Topics Beatrice had been taught were unfeminine and inappropriate. "You think carefully," Alexander observed one afternoon as they strolled beneath budding trees. "You see patterns others ignore." No one had ever said that to her before. At night they sat by the fire reading aloud, sometimes poetry, sometimes philosophy. Their shoulders gradually drew closer, though neither acknowledged the shift. Beatrice found herself laughing more often, the sound unfamiliar and slightly startling when it escaped her. With each passing day, something inside her softened. She began to speak without rehearsing her words first. She began to admit uncertainty instead of hiding it. And slowly, dangerously, she began to feel safe. The first physical contact came almost by accident. Alexander offered her his hand as they crossed uneven ground during a walk. She hesitated, then placed her fingers in his. His grip was steady, warm, entirely without insistence. Her pulse leapt at the contact. That night, when he drew her closer as they read by the fire, she did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into him. The realization startled her more than the act itself. Her body responded before her mind could catch up, her breath shortening, her awareness sharpening. Years of conditioning rose immediately to smother the sensation. This is wrong. Shameful. Dangerous. She withdrew abruptly. Alexander noticed at once. I'm sorry, he said. I should have asked. No, she said quickly, shaken. You did nothing wrong. The truth trembled just beneath her words, unspoken. Later that evening she confessed it. She spoke haltingly, shame burning her cheeks as she admitted the confusion. The unwanted heat, the guilt, the fear that desire itself marked her as improper. Alexander listened without judgment. Desire is not corruption, he said quietly. It is trust. It is the body recognizing safety. Her eyes filled despite her efforts. It frightens me, she admitted. I was taught to believe it was something to survive, not feel. He took her hands, careful, grounding. Then we will move slowly, he said. And every step will be yours to choose. The first kiss came weeks later. They were caught in the library during a sudden storm, rain lashing against the tall windows, thunder muting the world beyond the walls. They spoke of loneliness, his shaped by guilt, hers shaped by invisibility. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. Alexander wiped them away gently. Then he paused. May I? He asked, his voice low. The question changed everything. Beatrice nodded, barely breathing. The kiss was soft, tentative, exploratory. There was no urgency in it, only discovery. Her knees weakened and she gripped his coat to steady herself. When he pulled back, he searched her face. Do you wish me to continue? Yes, she whispered. The word felt like rebellion and liberation. Their intimacy deepened gradually after that, guided by patience rather than hunger. When they finally shared the marriage bed, it was not an ordeal endured in silence, but an experience navigated together, tentative, imperfect, profoundly human. Beatrice learned in Alexander's arms that pleasure was not shameful, that her responses were not a betrayal of virtue, but evidence of trust. And when she closed her eyes this time, it was not to endure, it was to feel. Their return to London marked the end of the quiet cocoon Beatrice had come to rely upon. Silverton House in the city stood grand and imposing, its facade immaculate, its interiors echoing with the muted activity of servants preparing for the season. Carriages lined the street, visitors calling within hours of their arrival. Cards were left. Invitations extended. Polite smiles offered. And beneath every courtesy, judgment waited. Beatrice felt it almost immediately, the weight of countless assessing gazes, the subtle pauses in conversation when she entered a room, the faint tightening of lips behind fans. London society did not shout its cruelty. It whispered it, refined it, sharpened it until it cut without drawing blood. She was not what they had expected. She was not young. She was not dazzling. She was not the triumphant ornament a duke was meant to display. At their first ball, Beatrice stood beside Alexander, her posture composed, her expression calm, while her pulse raced beneath silk gloves. Women's eyes slid over her with polite disinterest before lingering, curious, disapproving. Men bowed correctly, their smiles courteous but puzzled. What unsettled the ton most, however, was not Beatrice herself. It was Alexander. He did not abandon his wife to circulate alone. He danced with her more than once. He leaned close when she spoke, listening with visible attention. His hand rested at her back, warm and steady, an intimacy that defied convention. Such devotion, openly displayed, made people uneasy. The whispers began within days. That the Duke must be indulging in sentimentality born of grief. That the marriage was an act of penance. That he would tire of his plain wife once the novelty of virtue wore thin. Beatrice told herself she did not care. but the voices found their way into her thoughts regardless. At first, she dismissed them, reminding herself of the private certainty she shared with Alexander. Yet as days passed, something inside her began to tighten. A familiar tension returned to her shoulders. Her laughter softened, then faded. She began to choose her words more carefully again. Alexander noticed. She deferred to his opinions at breakfast. She declined his hand during walks. In their private chambers, she stiffened beneath his touch, her eyes closing, her body growing still. The change was subtle, but devastatingly familiar. It was the woman he had sworn never to become again. One evening, when she turned away from his kiss with a murmured apology about fatigue, Alexander gently but firmly took her shoulders and turned her to face him. "Tell me," he said, his voice controlled but tight. "What has changed?" She lowered her eyes. "Nothing," she said automatically. "Beatrice," he said, more sharply than she had ever heard him. Then he softened. "Please." The silence stretched. Finally the dam broke. She told him about the whispers, the pitying looks, the matrons at a musicale who had speculated, unaware she stood behind a curtain, that he would soon seek more appropriate companionship. She told him how each word echoed the fears she had carried all her life. And then, haltingly, she told him about her mother. About the wedding night council. The belief that endurance was virtue. That pleasure was dangerous. That kindness was temporary. "Perhaps she was right," Beatrice whispered, tears spilling freely now. "Perhaps I was foolish to believe this could last." Alexander went very still. Then he stood. His fury was immediate and unrestrained, but not directed at her. "What you were taught," he said, pacing the room, his hands clenched, "was not wisdom. It was poison. A woman broken by her own life trying to convince herself that suffering was inevitable." He stopped in front of her and knelt, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me," he said fiercely. "I did not marry you out of charity. I married you because you are intelligent, thoughtful, and strong in ways this world refuses to value. I love you, Beatrice." The word hung between them, terrifying and luminous. She shook her head, unable to accept it fully. "Then I will prove it," he said decisively. "To you and to them." He outlined his plan without hesitation. A ball at Silverton House. The grandest of the season. A public declaration no one could ignore. And before that, one final reckoning. "You must speak to your mother," he said. "Not for her approval, but to free yourself." 3 days later, Beatrice returned to the vicarage of her childhood. The house seemed smaller than she remembered. Narrower. As though it had been shrinking all her life. Her mother received her stiffly, suspicion evident. Beatrice did not sit. "The advice you gave me," she said calmly, "was wrong." Her mother's face flushed. "Marriage is not endurance," Beatrice continued. "A wife is not an object to be survived. I will not live as you taught me to." Her mother's outrage was immediate. Accusations followed, of corruption, of fantasy, of arrogance. Beatrice listened without anger. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "that your life taught you suffering was inevitable. But I will not inherit that belief." She left without looking back. The night of the Silverton House ball arrived with electric anticipation. Every invitation was accepted. Beatrice stood beside Alexander at the top of the staircase, her sapphire gown shimmering beneath candlelight. Her heart pounded, but she stood tall. When the music began, Alexander led her onto the floor alone. They danced. And as they moved, the room changed. People watched the way he looked at her, with pride, with warmth, with unmistakable devotion. Whispers faltered. Doubt wavered. When the dance ended, Alexander raised his glass. He spoke of partnership, of respect, of love. And then he honored her, publicly, unequivocally. Any remaining doubt died in that moment. By the evening's end, Beatrice was no longer an object of pity. She was the Duchess of Silverton. Later, alone in their chambers, Beatrice leaned against Alexander, exhausted and triumphant. "How far we've come," she murmured. He kissed her temple. "Your pleasure comes first," he said softly. Months later, as winter blanketed the estate in snow, Beatrice placed his hand over her belly. A child. A future. Built not on endurance but on choice.